All right, thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to get started, and I'm recording this CLE. We're also asking for credit for on-demand CLEs, so hoping to get both of those CLEs approved. In just a minute, I'm going to take a screenshot of all the people in attendance for CLE purposes. So if you have a name other than your own, or that might be confusing to make out, feel free to change your name so that it's clear to the CLE authorities who is actually attending the CLE, so that we can have clear records. So my name is Amy Berquist. I work at the Advocates for Human Rights in our International Justice Program, and our role in the International Justice Program is really to be a megaphone. We seek to amplify the voices of our partners so that they can be heard, so they can leverage the United Nations system to press their governments to improve their human rights record. And what you'll be learning about today is one of the amazing ways we're able to do that with the help of our pro bono partners in writing reports to the United Nations on death penalty issues. There are two different CLAs we'll be doing today. The first one is up on your screen, is about writing a report on death penalty issues for the Universal Periodic Review. So that'll be the first hour. The second hour will be a separate CLE. There will be a little bit of overlap, but that will focus on engaging with a different United Nations body, which is the Committee Against Torture. And some of you who are here are actually in the midst of preparing UPR reports for us. Thank you for volunteering, and this will help get you off to a great start for that project that you're working on. If you're not currently volunteering on a UPR report on the death penalty, we have upcoming opportunities. So make sure you connect either with me or with our pro bono counsel, Teresa Dykowczyk, so that you can be on our list for future opportunities.
This is John Montague from the IRS Office of Chief Counsel, calling back about scheduling or rescheduling this pre-submission conference.
Hi, John. Yeah, thanks for calling back.
Hey, I think there's somebody who has.
Sure.
It was not on.
Did you have a time on either September 13 or the following week that would work for you all?
Okay, I think that solved the problem. Sorry about that, Jack. Jack, if you want to be unmuted and share your meeting scheduling with us, feel free to send me a message. So we will get started, and let's move forward with the agenda for today. I'm going to provide some background on the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR. I apologize, we have a lot of different acronyms in our advocacy, but UPR is probably the only one I'll use in this first hour. Then we'll talk about issues related to the death penalty. Then we'll talk about using our template that we've created at the Advocates to assist our pro bono teams in drafting reports. Then we'll do a little bit of a dive into actual writing a stakeholder report, and then we'll talk a little bit about the recommendations in the context of the UPR, because they're a little bit distinct from the other types of recommendations that we use in other reports. And there will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, but if you want to go ahead and use the chat as I'm speaking, I'm happy to answer questions on the fly as well. So if you're not familiar with the Advocates for Human Rights, we were established in 1983. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. That's our only office, but we do work around the world. In Minnesota, focusing on the United States, and in other countries, focusing on issues in other countries as well. We work to implement international human rights standards in order to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. That's our mission. And we will move forward. And if you're not familiar with us, I really encourage you to learn more about us on our webpage, or reach out to talk about pro bono opportunities, because we have a lot of them. One of the really nice things about the Advocates for Human Rights is we're one of many organizations around the world that has what's called special consultative status at the United Nations. And that basically gets our foot in the door. We're able to do some advocacy at the United Nations that organizations without that status can't do. And this is one of the ways we serve as a megaphone, because if we're partnering with an organization that doesn't have that status, we work with them so that they can make use of our status to be able to take the floor at the Human Rights Council, for example, and to visit the United Nations in Geneva and enter the UN grounds to engage in lobbying and other kinds of advocacy. the overall, I guess you would call it a theory of change with respect to the advocates' work on the death penalty and on other human rights issues, is that there's a deep connection between the global, the international human rights system, and individual country change. So our partner organizations that are working to abolish the death penalty in their country or reduce the use of the death penalty, they are working hard to do that and doing their domestic lobbying and advocacy, but in a lot of ways, using the framework of international human rights, using the language of human rights helps bolster their position. And in particular, getting the human rights experts at the United Nations to press their authorities to change often results in more movement than would otherwise happen if it were just the local human rights defenders advocating for human rights. And similarly, once that change is effectuated, the human rights defenders can go back to the United Nations, report on what progress has happened, what problems they've been having, and then the United Nations can again press for further change, because we know that we can't just say, okay, human rights have been accomplished, we need and wrap it all up in a bow. It's an ongoing process of improving human rights in every country in the world. So first, a little bit of background about the UPR, or Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review is one we call the mechanism. It's one UN body or one universe of advocacy at the United Nations. And it falls into this larger bucket called charter-based mechanisms. And the second hour, we'll talk about treaty-based mechanisms, which is kind of the other bucket that our human rights advocacy falls into. But the bucket that's called charter-based mechanisms, as the name suggests, these bodies or mechanisms get their power from the UN Charter, and therefore they apply to all members of the United Nations. So it doesn't matter whether a country has ratified a particular treaty, whether a country has a good or bad reputation. Simply because a country is a member of the United Nations, these mechanisms are fair game. And that's really helpful in countries that don't necessarily ratify a lot of treaties, like the United States, for example. We can always go to those charter-based mechanisms to engage in advocacy. The meetings of charter-based mechanisms typically happen in Geneva at a large complex called the Palais des Nations, which you see in the photo there. And the advocates typically goes to Geneva every March to engage in advocacy. Sometimes we'll go at other times of the year, but March is a really good time for us to go engage in advocacy, in particular because another charter-based mechanism that the UPR falls under, the Human Rights Council, is in session during the entire month of March. So that's really useful. And we've had pro bono partners come along with us to Geneva in March as well for those advocacy trips. So the UPR is a charter-based mechanism, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail about what the UPR is. You'll see in the photo on the left, this is the main room where the Human Rights Council meets and where the UPR in-person activity happens. And the UPR happens for every country every 5 years. So it's on a staggered basis, of course. They don't review every country all at the same time. They typically do 12 to 15 countries in a go, do 3 sessions a year. And over the course of 5 years, they work through all UN member states. The sort of pinnacle, the most exciting time in the UPR process is what's called the interactive dialogue, which is a 3.5-hour session in the Human Rights Council room, where all eyes focus on one particular country and its human rights record. And every human rights issue is fair game. So people might talk about the death penalty, but they might talk about the rights of the child. They might talk about economic rights, the right to organize a labor union, for example. They might talk about environmental issues. So any sorts of human rights issues are fair game. And when we're doing a death penalty advocacy, we're really trying to ensure that during that 3.5 hours, there's sufficient attention dedicated to death penalty issues. So that's sort of our end goal, or one of our end goals, is to make sure that during that interactive dialogue, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of chatter, and a lot of pressure on governments about death penalty issues. The Universal Periodic Review is unique among the human rights mechanisms at the United Nations because it's a state-driven process. The governments themselves are in charge, not independent experts, and it's diplomats, representatives of governments themselves, who are the ones making recommendations. So there's kind of a political overtone to the UPR because it's governments making recommendations to other governments. And another aspect of the UPR that is unique among the different human rights mechanisms we work with is that the country that receives the recommendations can give the recommendations a thumbs up or thumbs down. They have the choice, are we going to do this or not? For the other mechanisms, there's no opportunity in part of the procedure for a government to say, oh yeah, we'll do that, or no, we're not going to do that. But in the UPR, it's up to the government receiving the recommendations to decide whether they're going to do it. And that's really important strategically when we think about our reporting and what kinds of recommendations we're going to make, because we want to make recommendations that are going to push the limits of what we think the government is going to be willing to do. So that's an important part of the strategy for the UPR. The UPR, as I said, it takes place every 5 years for every country. And so there's a cycle. And where we are in the cycle for the 3 countries that people are working on for the deadline that we have coming up in September is at stage 1, is preparation of information for the review. So we're getting our information as civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations. We are preparing that information for review. The government is also preparing its own report for the review. Then what we'll see happening in May of next year is the interactive dialogue. And that's that 3.5-hour session. Then following up after that in September will be the adoption of the report, the adoption of the whole interactive process. And at the point of the adoption of the report, that's when the government has to, that's sort of the deadline for the government to say, yes, we'll do it. No, we won't. And then the rest of the 5-year cycle is implementation of recommendations. It's up to the government that then accepted those recommendations. They have to race until that next UPR happens to implement the recommendations that they accepted. And so some of them are relatively easy to implement, and sometimes they sort of get behind the 8 ball. Like with Kenya, for example, Kenya, the last time around, accepted recommendations to abolish the death penalty, but it has not yet done so. So we would expect that lawmakers in Kenya are getting a little nervous, getting a little sweaty, saying, oh, wait, we have to go to Geneva in May of 2025 and we still haven't abolished the death penalty. What are we going to do? It's going to be really embarrassing if we show up in Geneva not having done what we promised to do last time around. So sometimes there's a bit of a rush as you get closer to the next UPR interactive dialogue to get stuff done. During the reporting cycle at the different stages, there are different things that happen. So as I mentioned, at that first stage where we are now, the government is doing its own report. We as stakeholders are doing our own reports. Then the UN officials summarize all of those reports, compile that information. Then we jump ahead to what will happen next May, which is the interactive dialogue. And the government will give its own, the government will send a delegation. It might just be a couple people. It might be, like in the case of the United States, you have several dozen people who go to Geneva. They give an oral report, like a summary. Here's what we've done over the last 5 years. Then you get the actual interactive dialogue where any other government in the world can make recommendations. Then everything is summarized almost verbatim in the report of the working group. And then the government has a chance to consider each recommendation to decide, are we going to do it? Are we not going to do it? And sometimes they offer some explanations as well. And so that's at stage 3, where there's sort of wrap it all up in a bow. The government makes its decisions, comes back to Geneva, says, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're not going to do. And then that's when civil society organizations can also make statements, and the report will be adopted. And then we jump into the implementation phase. Opportunities for civil society organizations to participate in the UPR reporting cycle. Well, before the review, that's what we're doing right now. We're preparing to submit stakeholder reports. Some governments will also, and this is a good practice, will also consult with civil society as they're preparing their own report. They'll want to get input from civil society organizations. Some governments are better than others in doing that. And then another thing that will happen when we go to Geneva in March is that the civil society organizations will lobby other member states on issues that they want them to raise during the review. So we will send out more than 100 emails to different permanent missions in Geneva. And our partner organizations will lobby the embassies in their home countries. And we will really try to encourage them to raise the issues that we're focusing on, such as the death penalty, and to make the recommendations that we've identified as most helpful for moving the ball forward toward abolition of the death penalty. Then during the review, we can watch online, we can attend in person if we have consultative status, as the Advocates does. Some of our partner organizations have held press conferences during the review to make a big deal about what happened. And they can also hold side events if they have consultative status. So to have a separate sort of press briefing on the margins of the Human Rights Council session where the UPR is happening. And then after the recommendations are received, there's several months gap where the government gets to decide, are they going to do something or not? And so that's a big opportunity for us and for our partner organizations to lobby the government, say, we really want you to accept these 3 recommendations, and can also say, we'd like to collaborate with you, help you implement them, and so on. And then, of course, it's implementing those accepted recommendations as part of the process. So what do, I thought there was just going to be one acronym, but I see on this slide there's another one. NGO stands for non-governmental organization. Our advocacy in the Universal Periodic Review is writing these stakeholder reports that we're talking about today. We hope those reports are included in a summary report, and then we do electronic and in-person advocacy with Human Rights Council delegates. And here you see my colleague Nathan Madsen, who's on the part of this training right now, listening in. Nathan is in Geneva with some partners lobbying Human Rights Council delegates in Geneva in the lead up to that interactive dialogue. So really having those face-to-face meetings can be very important to really bring things to light, especially if we can have our partner organizations represented and be there in person to tell them face-to-face what's going on in their home countries and why certain recommendations would be really helpful. And the country representatives in Geneva really appreciate those opportunities to hear firsthand from others, from people in those countries that are being reviewed about what's really going on and what's going to be most helpful. So when we talk about the death penalty, and I should say before we jump into the issues, the Advocates for Human Rights is a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which is a coalition of about 165 organizations around the world. And we serve on the steering committee of the World Coalition. And one of our roles in the coalition is to make sure that whenever there's a UN body, including the UPR, that's reviewing a country that hasn't completely abolished the death penalty, to make sure that that body has relevant death penalty information at its fingertips for that review. So we want to make sure that no country slips through the cracks. So we'll work with the coalition members to make sure that either they're doing a report or that we'll work with them on doing a report, or if we don't have a coalition member in the country, then we'll write the report on our own in collaboration, maybe with partners in the region or in collaboration with the coalition itself. But what kind of issues do we raise in our advocacy? There are a lot of different issues that touch on the death penalty, and it's important as you're formulating your reports to think broadly about what could possibly be connected to the death penalty. Of course, the death penalty itself, is it on the books? What crimes are eligible? That's important, but there are also other issues that touch on the death penalty. So if we're looking just at what the law says, international human rights standards say that the death penalty, if it exists in a country, has to be limited to the most serious crimes. So we'll look at the list of crimes that are eligible for the death penalty in a country and see, did they all rise to that level? Well, what do we mean by most serious? Most serious crimes are crimes that involve a killing that's intentional and that was committed by the person who is at risk of being sentenced to death. So those are the 3 elements that amount to most serious under international human rights standards. So something like the felony murder rule, that doesn't rise to most serious. And things like drug trafficking, rape, apostasy, those types of crimes also do not rise to the level of most serious. So we'd want to point that out to say this country has these crimes on the books. Some of them do not rise to the level of most serious. Even terrorism in a lot of countries is really vaguely defined, doesn't require any killing at all for somebody to be accused of terrorism. So that would be another crime to point out that doesn't rise to that level. Also, some countries have a mandatory death penalty. If a person is found guilty of a particular crime, it's mandatory that they be sentenced to death. That is also a human rights violation because that's arbitrary. It doesn't consider the facts and circumstances behind the crime itself or the background of the offender. Juvenile offenders, people by international human rights standards say that no person should be sentenced to death for an offense that they committed when they were under the age of 18. So in some countries, that's also an issue. It was until recently an issue in the United States. There were states that were sentencing people to death for juvenile offenses. We also want to look at, for example, people with psychosocial disabilities, and whether they were afforded fair trial protections, whether their disabilities were accommodated by the criminal legal system in resulting in that death sentence. And then there are other more general fair trial issues. Now, these fair trial issues might apply to all people in conflict with the law, but they may also apply equally to people who are charged with death eligible offenses or ultimately sentenced to death. So issues like access to counsel and the quality of legal counsel, the use of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in the process of obtaining a confession, for example, having an impartial judiciary. In some countries, the executive controls the judiciary and can influence judges to issue a death sentence. We will also look at detention conditions for people under sentence of death. In some countries, they're commingled. So people under sentence of death live in the same facilities as people under other sentences. In others, they're separate. But we do want to look at what those detention conditions are that would apply to people under sentence of death and see whether those violate international human rights standards. Also, international human rights standards say if you've been sentenced to death, you must have the right to appeal. So that's another thing we would look for. We might also look at execution methods and whether those might amount to torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Then we'll look at gender and the death penalty. We are, with the World Coalition, engaging on an important project focusing on women sentenced to death. We know that women make up a very small percentage of people under sentence of death. But if we focus in on the cases of those women, a lot of women have experienced gender-based violence that might contribute to their likelihood to commit a crime, such as a long-term victim of domestic violence, killing her abuser and being sentenced to death for that murder. And we also know that within criminal legal systems, there can be a lot of discrimination toward women, especially if they're perceived as not complying with traditional feminine stereotypes. They're more likely to be sentenced to death. So we try in any report for any country that may have women under sentence of death, we try to include a section highlighting issues related to women, gender, and the death penalty. And then there are other issues relating to discrimination. For example, migrant and domestic workers may be more likely to be sentenced to death. There may be ethnic minorities or other minorities who may be more likely than others to be sentenced to death in a particular country. And members of the LGBTIQ+ communities might also either be more likely to be sentenced to death for an ordinary offense, or in a few countries, the death penalty is a legal sanction for consensual same-sex conduct between adults. And that would, of course, be something to highlight that certainly doesn't rise to the level of a most serious crime. We also would look at human rights defenders, in other words, people who are either representing people who are sentenced to death or people who are advocating for abolition of the death penalty. In some countries, those people face persecution, face harassment by the government, and we would want to highlight those issues as well if they are relevant. One thing I will say, because it comes up from time to time, there is a concept called extrajudicial executions. And what that means is it's a person being executed outside of the judicial process. And this is a horrible human rights violation, but it's not a human rights violation we typically cover in our UN advocacy, because we are focusing with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, we're focusing on judicially authorized executions. So check with me if you're concerned about whether you should raise that issue in your report. Chances are I'll say skip that issue for that report, for your report. There is on our YouTube channel a video that we created a few years back. And if you're on one of our current pro bono teams, I already gave you the link to this video. Otherwise, you can hunt around on our YouTube channel for this video. It's a longer video, a little bit over an hour, but it goes into more detail about the different issues that we focus on for our UN reporting on the death penalty. Now I want to talk a little bit about the template that we use for our UN reporting. Those of you who are currently on Teams should have received this template, but here you have the sample cover page for the template, and you have a little bit of information to fill in, like the state party, the number of the session for the UPR, the dates of the session, and the date we submit it. You can leave off the date we submit it because we'll be taking care of that. But if we have additional partner organizations that we're working with, that you're communicating with, we'll want to add them to the cover page as well. The body of the template, these headings are probably the main headings that you're going to focus on. Again, extrajudicial summary or arbitrary, and I should say that these headings are not the Advocates for Human Rights headings. They are headings that the United Nations uses in talking about all the issues that are raised in the UPR. So we just copied and pasted the exact language to make it easier for the people at the UN who are looking at our report to know which categories we're talking about. And I'll also say for these categories, sometimes there's some overlap. And in some cases, it's fine to combine two different headings into the same section of your report, if that makes sense. For example, there's a heading on violence against women and another heading about gender-based violence. You could combine both of those as a heading for the section of your report that talks about women, gender, and the death penalty. The main section of your report, though, is going to be the one with the heading, the death penalty. And under each heading, you're going to give a little bit of a scorecard for what happened to the recommendations the previous time around. So you're going to look at the recommendations that were made in the third cycle, because now we're in the fourth cycle, and you're going to summarize any of the recommendations that the country received on that particular topic. It's possible they didn't receive any, but certainly with respect to the death penalty, they received recommendations on the death penalty. And in bold and underlined, you're going to say, was it accepted or not accepted? And then, has it been implemented, partially implemented, or fully implemented? So you're just going to give that little scorecard across the top. And then in numbered paragraphs, you're going to summarize what those recommendations were from the last time around, discuss whether, if there's a need to discuss, or just say whether it's been implemented. And then you're going to, in the heart of the section, is going to be providing recent developments. What's happened since the UPR, the previous UPR, on those issues. So for all the countries that are coming up with deadlines, the previous UPR was in 2020. So that's sort of the time frame for looking back. You will, in the death penalty section, you'll probably want to give sort of a general overview of death penalty issues, like the number of people who are under sentence of death, the number of executions the country has had since the previous UPR, what crimes are eligible for the death penalty. You can put that earlier on in the report and just summarize it at this point in the report, or you can put it all here. We can be flexible in that way. And, to the extent that a topic is relevant here and in another section, you can put all the information here and then just make a quick cross-reference in another section. For example, if a country executes juvenile offenders, you can mention that here in the death penalty section, but you can also have a brief section that's about the rights of the child under the heading that's relevant to the rights of the child, and just say, just reiterate, this country also authorizes the death penalty and has executed juvenile offenders. See paragraph whatever above, and we'll make sure that those cross-references match up before we submit the report. Case studies can be really helpful. You don't have to always have numerical statistics for this report. You can have just examples of issues that have arisen under the particular heading. So it's fine to give those if you find credible information to include them in the report in that way. So a couple of other headings just from this screenshot: the prohibition against torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. There you might raise the issue of whether people who are charged with capital crimes are tortured to extract confessions, or whether torture-tainted confessions are admitted into evidence in capital proceedings. And if you have more specific information about torture or cruel treatment in detention, you would put that under the next category, which is a little bit more specific about conditions of detention. So that's kind of an overview of how the template works and how you'd incorporate that information. where to find the relevant information. So for all of the teams currently working, I gave you a link to the country page for you. So this is an example of Kenya's. And one document that I might not have mentioned in the initial email that I sent is the matrix of recommendations. Some of our pro bono teams find this document really helpful to look at, and you're welcome to look at it. Make sure you're in the 3rd cycle because that's the most recent one. And the matrix is simply a more organized presentation of all the recommendations that the country received during the previous UPR. And here you can see that Kenya's previous UPR was on January 23rd, 2020. So if you look at that matrix, you'll find the section that's relevant to the death penalty. And this is just a little bit of an excerpt of that section. And you can see that, recommendation 142.81 was from Namibia to commute the death sentences of the remaining 810 death row inmates. And you see in the middle column that was supported. Kenya agreed to do that. And so one of the things we'll want to highlight in our Kenya report is, did they actually commute those sentences for those 810 people? And you'll see that over on the right-hand side, there are different categories that particular recommendation falls under according to the United Nations staff. So that can be a helpful document, but this isn't sort of an official document. It's really just a guide to help you make sense of the recommendations that were made during the previous UPR. The actual original source documents are under the heading, the outcome of the review, a little bit further down the webpage. The report of the working group is the nearly verbatim summary of everything that was said in that 3.5-hour session and that interactive dialogue. You'll see at the beginning, not in bold, summaries of things that different countries said, including the country being reviewed. That can be really helpful to, for example, hear what did the Kenyan officials say about the death penalty when they had the chance to present their state report and respond to some of the comments they were hearing during the interactive dialogue. That can give us some insights into what was in their minds, what were their public pronouncements, and what might we be able to get them to do next time around. But also at the end of that report of the working group in bold is the verbatim replication of every single recommendation the country received. That verbatim replication might be organized by categories. These recommendations were accepted or supported by Kenya, and these recommendations were noted or not accepted by the government of Kenya, or it might just be all of the recommendations all at once. If Kenya decided right away, it will be organized by categories. If Kenya decided to wait the several months that Kenya had to make decisions, then Kenya would have submitted an addendum, which is the second document that's circled. And that addendum would go through each recommendation one by one to say, yes, we accept it. No, we're going to note it. And in some cases also provide some explanation, which again can be really helpful in shaping our advocacy, deciding what recommendations we want to push for this time around, and really helping to understand what the government's position is with respect to the death penalty. In terms of how the report plays out, here's an example of a report we submitted recently for the UPR of Bangladesh. And you'll see, I just want to walk through how this works. You'll see we don't go into detail like quoting verbatim every recommendation Bangladesh received. We just said UN member states made several recommendations relating to the death penalty. Bangladesh noted, which is the UN speak for rejected, all of these recommendations, including recommendations to do blah, 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 blah. And Bangladesh hasn't implemented any of these recommendations. So status of implementation, not accepted, not implemented. And then the seventh paragraph that you see gives a little bit of explanation. Here's what the government's position is. Bangladesh asserted the death penalty remains a valid form of punishment and that there are layers of safeguards and so on. So giving the government's basic position can be really helpful in terms of framing what's Bangladesh's position on the death penalty. And then paragraphs 8 and 9 go into giving current information. Right now, there are 33 crimes that are eligible for the death penalty. It's 25 of them are non-fatal offenses, so they wouldn't be most serious crimes, and so on and so forth. So getting into the presenting the on-the-ground information. And the countries that we ultimately lobby really appreciate having this information because they want to know what's actually going on in the country so that they can formulate good recommendations to make during that interactive dialogue. So that's really helpful information that we can present to them, and you can do the legal research to pull that information together. So writing the report itself. Oh, we have somebody joining us. There we go. So writing the stakeholder report itself, there are a few sort of format things, and most of these format requirements are not from us, but from the United Nations. The report needs to be in Microsoft Word format. It needs to have a cover page, which our template gives you. We have a word limit, and for all of our death penalty reports, we are always doing joint reports with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and oftentimes other partner organizations. So the word limit is 5,630 words, and that excludes the endnotes. We can, but don't typically use annexes. But if our partner organization has a really good report that we summarize, but want to make sure that it's in the hands of the people who receive the report, we can attach annexes. All pages and all paragraphs need to be numbered. And we need to use endnotes rather than footnotes. That was a decision by the powers that be at the United Nations, not a decision of ours. If you, like me, can't stand endnotes, you can use footnotes and then just convert them all to endnotes before you send your report to me, and I won't be any the wiser. And that word limit excludes the endnotes and excludes the cover page. Most of our reports aren't anywhere near the word limit, so don't feel like, oh, this report is really short. It's actually the length of an individual submission. That's fine. It doesn't have to be longer. Use the space that you need, but don't feel as though you need to write more just because there is this word limit to strive for. Less is just fine. Another little note about people first language. I think you saw that in the Namibia recommendation, using the terms prisoner or convict, people on death row. We at the Advocates for Human Rights and a lot of human rights organizations really wanted to emphasize using people first language. Recognize people as individuals before we recognize their status, because we are all more than the worst thing we've done. We're more than our situation in being in incarceration. So we'll refer to people in detention, people who are under sentence of death, similarly, people with disabilities. So try to avoid words like prisoners, the condemned, disabled people, things like that. So try to use people first language and avoid terms that might essentialize or emphasize that the only thing we care about for this person is that they are a prisoner, that they're condemned to death. That will appreciate your use of language in that way. So what are we covering in our UPR reports? The official guidelines tell us that we're supposed to cover implementation of recommendations from the previous cycle. So that's why that beginning paragraph says, here are the recommendations that they received. Now, in a lot of cases, the governments haven't accepted the recommendations, but nonetheless, we'll look at these are the recommendations they received. They didn't accept them, and here's what they have or haven't done to implement them. We'll also look at regressive actions since the last UPR. Has there been any backsliding with respect to the death penalty or related issues since the last time? Have they threatened to resume executions, for example, as has been the case with the Democratic Republic of the Congo? And so we'll be on the lookout for that. And countries can get really concerned if there seems to be backsliding on death penalty issues. That's really important to mention in the report. And any progress, if the government has a UPR follow-up action plan, we'll want to see if there's any progress specifically related to our issues. And the big catch-all is any other developments since the last UPR. So maybe there's a particularly interesting case that highlights human rights issues about one person who was sentenced to death, or maybe there was a woman sentenced to death on drug-related charges since the last UPR. You could just highlight that particular case to illustrate they don't limit the death penalty to drug-related offenses. Here are some of the facts around the woman's offense that highlight some issues related to gender-based discrimination and so on. So any kind of other developments are fair game to include in our report. These are sort of the guidelines from the UN officials about what we're supposed to put in the substance of the report: credible and reliable information, highlight the main issues of concern, focus on the period since the last review, don't use abusive language. We generally don't have these problems with our pro bono attorneys. And then they encourage joint submissions. So having a submission from the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and an abolitionist organization in the country that's being reviewed, that's ideal. And we try to do that whenever possible. But you as pro bono attorneys don't have to worry about that piece. That's really our piece to worry about. But it's a way to make our our report more welcome in the hands of the people who receive it. These are again this is more guidance from the UN about what to include in the substance of the report. It says to prioritize firsthand information and the stakeholders' own views, findings, and conclusions, but sometimes it's just looking at the country's criminal code and seeing, okay, these crimes are eligible for the death penalty. That's not really firsthand information, but it's what the law says, and that's important to include. We may be able to find sort of secondhand information in the press about case studies that aren't in any official documents, and that's fine to include. We do want to offer what we call SMART recommendations. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And we want to link the recommendations to the themes. So we want to make sure that for each bucket of topics that we talk about, we have recommendations that help address the issues we've identified. And we don't want to include in our report a list of all the treaties a country has ratified, text of recommendations from other UN bodies. We don't need to include any of that. That's already going to be packaged up by the UN staff. So we don't need to like throw UN stuff at the UN. They've got that piece of it taken care of. Some good practices for your reports is framing your issues the way we had in the example on Bangladesh, and we'll take a look at that again. Use your recommendations to frame your arguments in organizing your report. So think about what recommendations you want to see happening during the interactive dialogue and help those recommendations organize what you're going to talk about in your report. So, and another good practice is to say, okay, here's what the government's position is, or here's what the law says, and then here's what's really going on, or here's the problem with that. You can use stories, case studies to highlight gaps in the law, meaning, you know, the government allows, for example, allows self-defense as a defense in capital cases for murder if a person is charged with murder, but the self-defense has to arise in the case of an imminent threat to the person's life. So that's actually a normal self-defense standard, has those requirements. And where there may be a gap is where a woman has been a longtime victim of domestic violence and her abuser is much bigger and stronger than she is, and she takes advantage of the fact that he's passed out on the couch and kills him then. But self-defense is not allowed in that circumstance in most countries, and it's not even allowed to be brought forward in mitigation when it's time to determine what her sentence is. And so that would be a gap in the law where the legal system doesn't take into account that a person is a long-term victim of domestic violence in assessing what the penalty should be for her conduct in killing another person. Or barriers to implementation. If there are attitudinal issues, for example, that a barrier to implementation might be that defense counsel who are representing women don't have any training or background on coercive control or gender-based violence. So they might not even know to raise the issue at sentencing to talk about why this woman killed her husband. So so that might be a barrier to implementation, even if the law would allow that evidence to be presented in mitigation at the time of sentencing, that the attorneys don't think to raise that because they haven't received any training. And then you'd think about, okay, what recommendations do you want to make that would help address that barrier to implementation? Don't provide any lengthy procedural history. Our audience is what they really want, where we really add value is the facts on the ground, what's going on in the country. You don't need to discuss the substance of particular rights. You don't need to lecture them on international human rights standards, say that a person shouldn't be executed for a crime they committed when they are under the age of 18. Our audience, they know that. They want to know, does this country authorize the execution of people for crimes they committed when they are under 18? Have they executed people for such crimes? They don't need to be lectured out about what those international standards say. You don't need to have this sort of lengthy legal analysis about what different articles of different treaties say. Present them with the facts on the ground. And another thing to avoid is vague recommendations, like improve your death penalty practices. We want to be a bit more specific. So going back to that example I provided on Bangladesh, here you see some good practices summarizing the recommendations from the previous round. Paragraph 7 provides the summary of the government's position, and paragraphs 8 and 9 provide what's going on the ground. Here are the different laws that authorize the death penalty, and then we go into saying, okay, how many people have been sentenced to death, what crimes have they been sentenced to death for, and so on and so forth. So that's where we're adding value in sort of responding to what the government's official position is on the death penalty and giving more information about what the current situation is. So now we'll jump in and talk about those recommendations. As I mentioned, it's really important and a really good practice as you're writing the report, or you can do this at the end after you finish the body of your report, but make sure for every problem or issue you address, you have a solution, a recommendation that will help resolve that or will help move the country toward resolution of that issue. Of course, abolish the death penalty, that would resolve a lot of these issues. But also think about more incremental recommendations would help move the ball forward that would help improve the situation. So ensure that the death penalty is limited to the most serious crimes as defined under international human rights law would really help if a country allows the death penalty for drug-related offenses or for apostasy, for example. Or you could say specifically abolish the death penalty for drug-related offenses. So make sure that you're offering solutions or recommendations that address each issue and try to make them, try to offer sort of a range of solutions, keeping in mind that a lot of governments are going to be really reluctant to completely abolish the death penalty, but they might be willing to do something at a more intermediate stage. And before I move on to this slide, I am going to, because I think everyone should be here. So I'm just going to take a moment to screenshot the attendance. Bear with me for just a moment. All right. Oops, out of the way. Okay, so when making your recommendations, one thing that's important to, we typically will get between 12 and 30 recommendations on death penalty issues over the course of the three and a half hours. And it's fine to have a bunch of recommendations saying the same thing, like abolish the death penalty, institute a formal moratorium. But it's also good to have more of a menu of recommendations, keeping in mind that the government ultimately is going to look at all those recommendations and decide, are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? So giving them a lot of different things to decide on is helpful. So, so think about that as you're coming up with your proposed recommendations. One thing I like to think about in terms of making those recommendations is what I like to call an offer you can't refuse. And what do I mean by that? I mean that sometimes we can make it really awkward for a government not to accept a recommendation. And I give Japan as an example. Japan retains the death penalty, continues to execute people. And whenever they're in a public forum like the UPR, they often say, well, the Japanese public supports the death penalty, and therefore we need to keep the death penalty. It's what the people want. So keeping that in mind, we came up with a recommendation that we proposed in our advocacy, and that recommendation was to engage in a public awareness raising campaign about issues relating to the death penalty and alternatives to the death penalty. So it wasn't saying abolish, it's just educate the public, because the Japanese government is very secretive about its death penalty practices. And in fact, the general public, which purportedly supports the death penalty, doesn't know much about what the government does. So this was kind of a way to call the government's bluff, to say, do you really want to be relying on the public? If you want to rely on public opinion, make sure that the public's opinion is educated. And Australia was one of the kind of governments we lobbied on this issue. And we explained the situation. And Australia made that recommendation. They made that recommendation to educate the public, do a public awareness raising campaign about death penalty issues. And that kind of called Japan's bluff. Japan nonetheless rejected that recommendation. They noted it. But I like to think that the Japanese officials felt a little sheepish in always relying on public opinion and then saying, no, we're not going to educate the public. So think about what other particular, given what we know about the particular government's position on the issues, are there recommendations we can craft that would kind of harness the government's position and turn it back around on them to make it so that they feel like they need to accept that recommendation? Another good strategy for making recommendations is if another UN body has reviewed that country's human rights record relatively recently, that body would have issued concluding observations and recommendations. And sometimes we can just advocate for, by cross-reference, for them to implement those recommendations. So implement the recommendations of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women with respect to the death penalty. That's a nice succinct recommendation that kind of incorporates by reference what would be a more detailed body of recommendations that you can see. And think about incremental change as well. It's fine, we want to swing for the fences to push for abolition of the death penalty. What are some smaller changes that we could advocate for, like comprehensive training in collaboration with civil society for defense attorneys who represent women in capital cases about gender-based violence and coercive control and how that might influence a woman's criminal behavior, for example? That's not going to abolish the death penalty, but could do a world of good for those women who are at risk of being sentenced to death, or for women who are sentenced to death, so that they'd have better qualified attorneys who are better able to represent them. SMART recommendations. You've probably heard this acronym in a variety of settings, so I apologize for throwing it at you again if this is old hat. But we want to make sure that the recommendations we're proposing are strong recommendations. So we want to make sure that they are specific, not general, that they're measurable. Can we tell in 5 years' time, has the government actually done what we asked them to do? Are they achievable? Is it something that could be accomplished during that 5 years, like end all violence against women? That's probably not achievable in the course of 5 years, but could they, institute a formal moratorium on executions in 5 years? Sure, they can do that with a stroke of a pen. That's simple. And are they relevant? Do they relate to actual human rights? And we sometimes see this where governments will make recommendations that aren't really related to human rights. But they can say whatever they want during the interactive dialogue. We're not going to propose irrelevant recommendations. And generally speaking, we want them to be time bound, but the beauty of the UPR is it happens every 5 years like clockwork. So we don't even need to put a time constraint on it. Implicit is that the recommendation will be implemented during the, before the next UPR happens. So that's my overview for all of you. For those of you who are teams, sorry about the background noise. For those of you who are teams working on reports right now for the UPR, your deadline is September 9th, 2024. My contact information is on the screen. So if any of you have questions for me, please shoot me an email. And we do have about 7 minutes for questions from all of you. So I'll leave my email up on the screen for a few more moments, and then I'll stop screen sharing so that we can have some discussion. See something popping up in the chat. Yeah, excellent. Mary asks, in the template, do you only complete the parts that are on the death penalty or tangentially relevant to the death penalty, or do you cover everything? The template is there with those different headings. That's a menu for you. You don't have to order everything on the menu. Choose the things on the template that are most relevant based on the research that you do. So we've kind of been over-inclusive in including things in the template, and you just delete the things that don't apply. The things that do apply, keep them in. But yeah, you don't, by no means should you include all of those headings. We've already trimmed them down for you to the things that we think might possibly be related to the death penalty, but you should be trimming them down even further based on your research. Like most countries, for example, don't execute juvenile offenders, so you'll just cut out the sections that are relevant to children and the rights of the child. But if your country is one that does allow execution of child offenders, you're going to keep that in. And I guess I know that there are some people who have already been involved in our UPR reporting. If you have any other insights to share, or if you want to really emphasize something that I said that maybe I said too quickly or glossed over, I invite you to unmute and share your perspective as well if you've already been through the process. And that includes my colleagues as well. Maybe I didn't emphasize something that you always try to hammer home when you do your trainings for our pro bono volunteers. I will add one more note before we wrap up about working with partners. Some of your teams have partners through the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And I'd like you to work with them, especially to help formulate good recommendations that they think would be useful, and they may be able to provide you with additional information on the ground. So if I haven't already, I'll be doing those email introductions, but I do want you to reach out. If you have a partner for your report, do reach out to them and try to include them as much as you can in the process. Some of our partners are more responsive than others, so don't get discouraged. Try to be persistent in reaching out to them. And we want to give them a chance also to, review the report when it's in draft stage, provide input. Maybe we haven't characterized something quite right, or maybe we've missed an entire area. Sometimes our partners have really good insights, and sometimes they say, well, don't talk about that because that's a really sensitive topic and it will be counterproductive. So our partners can be really useful in this regard. I just, since we have a couple minutes left before we wrap up, but again, feel free to chime in with questions. I want to give you a little sense of the trajectory. These reports are due in October, so we'll get them finalized, we'll get them uploaded, and then we get very busy starting in January, February. January is when we start identifying the target countries that we want to lobby, countries that have made recommendations on death penalty issues before, countries that, for whatever reason, we think are well situated to get involved, because remember, this is a political process. And then we come up with our list of countries we're going to identify, and we create one-pagers, which are back-to-back one-page documents. Oops, somebody's joining us. This is probably for the next session. So we create one-pagers and email those out to our target countries, summarizing the reports that we've submitted. And then we go to Geneva and we try to set up as many in-person meetings as possible with the different governments that we're targeting. Ideally, we'll bring our partner organizations to Geneva as well to engage in that lobbying process. And then, that happens roughly 6 to 8 weeks before the interactive dialogues. We stay at home because it takes about, the governments can't change their recommendations on the fly. They need some lead time. So we actually don't go to Geneva for the interactive dialogue itself. It's too late for us to influence the process then. But we watch online and cheer for any recommendations that are related to our advocacy. And then we wait to see how the government responds. And then we work on implementation. So it's an extensive process, but it's been really rewarding. We've had some great successes in countries that have abolished the death penalty. We think the evidence suggests in part because of this UPR advocacy. Most recently, Zambia abolished the death penalty in December 2022, and Sierra Leone abolished the death penalty the previous year. And both of those countries were countries we were doing a lot of extensive UPR lobbying on. So it's really rewarding. And we hope Kenya is next on the list, for example. So with that, I will wrap up. I am going to stop the recording because we have a new training starting up. If you want to stick around for the Committee Against Torture stuff, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll consider it the end of our UPR training, and we'll shift over to talking about the Torture Convention in just a moment.